The drone feed flickered, showing a wall of black ash that should have been solid rock. In the command center, the silence was heavy, broken only by the hum of cooling fans. Then a sound emerged from the screen. It was a high-pitched, tuneless whistling cutting through the roar of the atmospheric fires. Through the opaque haze of the Gale Ridge Sift Towers, a silhouette finally appeared. It moved with a slow, mechanical rhythm, parting the soot like a ghost. This was the dead zone of VAT-12, where oxygen had been replaced by a slurry of burning particulates. Yet there she was. Vara Korin emerged from the darkness, eyes narrowed to slits against the heat. She wasn't running. She was marching, dragging two limp Felathi workers across the metal decking, while the whistle continued to vibrate through the comms. The galaxy is a lethal place, but some of us were born in the fire. Listen to the end, you'll see why. 20 minutes earlier, the Gale Ridge Sift Towers had been a masterpiece of industrial silence. Director Trosick stood in the observation deck, his nape feathers smoothed flat in a gesture of professional satisfaction. Below him, the massive vats ground volatile agricultural yields into fine powders. The air in the facility was scrubbed to a purity that exceeded a mountain spring. For the Felathi, whose hollow bones and delicate crystalline lungs evolved for thin-air gliding, any impurity was a death sentence. Safety protocols were the religion of the towers. A single stray spark or a rise in dust density above 80 parts per million would trigger a total facility lockdown. It was a world of glass and precision, where even a sneeze was considered a security breach. Vara Korin sat in the corner of the break room, her boots resting on a low table. She was a mammal, heavy and grounded in a world of flighty, nervous avians. A frayed loop of canvas hung around her neck, a faded gaiter stained with machine oil and salt. She held a cup of lukewarm coffee, watching the steam rise in the pressurized air. "The humidity sensor is off again," Korin remarked, her voice a gravelly rumble. "Makes the air feel like wet wool." Trosick glanced at her from the doorway, his beak clicking in mild annoyance. "The sensors are calibrated to the fourth decimal, Korin. Perhaps your human skin is simply poorly adjusted today." Korin didn't argue, she just took a slow, deliberate sip of her coffee. Then she reached up and rolled her shoulders in a sharp, circular motion. It was a habit Trosick had seen 1,000 times, a mechanical reset before she began a shift. She stood up, the chair scraping against the floor, and reached for her gloves. At that exact moment, the deck beneath them shivered. It wasn't a crash, but a deep, tectonic groan that vibrated through the soles of their feet. The primary alarm didn't scream. It wailed in a mournful, dropping tone. Trosick's feathers flared rigidly outward as he sprinted to the telemetry bank. The monitors were already bleeding crimson. VAT-9 had suffered a pressure seal failure. The agricultural dust, a substance called spore chaff, was flooding the main corridor. On the screen, the readout for particulate density skipped past 100, then 200, and finally stabilized at a staggering 400 parts per million. "The workers in the catch pit," Trosick hissed, his voice thin with panic. "Kale and Vess, they're still down there." "They're dead," a technician whispered, his wings trembling. "At 400 ppm, their lungs would have turned to glass in seconds. The chaff reacts with Felathi mucus. It crystallizes." Korin was already moving. She didn't look at the screens. She didn't ask for permission. She grabbed the canvas gaiter from her neck and pulled it upward, covering her nose and mouth. She looked like a desert bandit from some ancient, forgotten era of her home world. "I'm going in," Korin said. Trosick grabbed her arm, his talons digging into her thick sleeve. "You'll die before you reach the first bulkhead. We don't even have a Grade-4 mech suit on this level. The air is solid fire." "Running uses oxygen," Korin replied, pulling her arm free. "So I won't run." She stepped into the airlock. The secondary explosion in VAT-10 ripped through the towers just as the inner door hissed open. A wall of black, swirling dust surged into the chamber. Korin didn't flinch. She stepped forward, disappearing into the opaque cloud. Trosick watched the external drone feeds, his heart hammering against his ribs. The human was walking into an environment that was chemically designed to kill. On the telemetry, the dust levels in the corridor spiked again, hitting 600 ppm. It was a concentration that would make a machine seize. Minutes crawled by. The audio feed from Korin's suit was a chaotic mess of static and the roar of rushing air. Then the sound changed. It became a rhythmic, forced exhalation, a brutal, wet sound that made Trosick's own chest feel tight. Following each breath was a sharp, tuneless whistle. "She's losing air," the technician cried out. "That's the sound of a failing lung." But the human didn't stop. The drone camera caught a glimpse of her through a momentary thinning of the smoke. She was carrying a Felathi technician named Kale over her shoulder. Kale was unconscious, his feathers coated in a gray, toxic frost, but he was breathing. Korin reached the airlock, dumped the body inside, and signaled for the medics. Her eyes were bloodshot and streaming with tears, her skin a mottled red from the heat. Before Trosick could speak, she turned back around. One more, she grunted, the words muffled by the damp canvas over her face. The third deflagration wave hit VAT 11. This was the big one. The shockwave blew out the thermal sensors, leaving the control room blind. They had only audio now. The whistling returned, louder this time, a piercing, defiant note that refused to be drowned out by the collapsing infrastructure. Trosick realized then that it wasn't a cry for help. It was a tool. Corin was using the whistle to force a specific, high-pressure exhalation. She was clearing her own lungs, using the mammalian reflex to expel the particulates before they could settle in her bronchi. A realization struck Trosick, one that made his beak go dry. Humans were evolved from the muck. They were descendants of creatures that lived in swamps and dust storms, whose bodies were designed to produce mucus, to cough, and to survive the very impurities that killed cleaner species. Her biology wasn't just enduring the disaster, it was fighting a war it had been practicing for millions of years. The telemetry suddenly registered a new anomaly. A technician pointed to a secondary reading near Corin's position. "Director, the human's skin temperature is rising, but she's not burning." She's venting moisture." "Sweat," Trosick whispered. "She's cooling herself from the inside." The third shockwave rolled out of VAT 12, a hammer of pressure that buckled the reinforced doors of the annex. Through the thermal static, the silhouette reappeared just as it had in the first moments of the crisis. Corin was no longer just a shift manager, she was a force of nature. She had a worker under each arm now, her boots finding purchase on the slick, ash-covered metal. Her chest heaved, a massive, bellows-like movement that sounded like a steam engine. She reached the threshold of the clean zone. The emergency sprinklers activated, drenching her in ice-cold water. Corin didn't collapse. She placed the last two workers onto the triage mats with a gentleness that seemed impossible given her exhaustion. She stood there for a moment, her head bowed, water dripping from the blackened canvas around her face. One of the medical droids moved toward her, its scanners humming. "Warning," the mechanical voice droned. "Subject's skin is coated in toxic sludge. Particulate density on clothing exceeds safety margins by 800%. Corin finally reached up and pulled the gaiter down. Her face was a mask of soot, save for the clean lines where the fabric had protected her skin. She looked at Trosick, her expression unreadable. "I need a glass of water," she said, her voice a dry rasp. "My throat is a bit scratchy." The silence in the annex was absolute. Trosick looked at the triage mats where 6 of his people were being stabilized. They would live, though their lungs would bear the scars of the crystallization for years. He looked back at Corin. She was already reaching for a towel, wiping the toxic paste from her forehead with a casual, bored movement. The alarm was still ringing, but the danger had passed. It had been defeated not by technology, but by the sheer, stubborn refusal of human lungs to stop moving. In the triage bay, the medical team began to strip the gear from the survivors. One of the technicians picked up the canvas gaiter Corin had dropped onto a tray. He let out a small gasp. The fabric didn't flop or fold. It had been so saturated with spore chaff and human sweat that it had hardened into a rigid gray cast. It sat on the metal tray, a perfect hollow mold of a human face, scorched and unyielding. Trosick watched as a junior technician tried to scrape a sample of the residue from Corin's arm. The boy's eyes widened. The sweat had mixed with the industrial dust to create a thick, caustic mortar. If a drop of it had touched Trosick's feathers, it would have burned through to the bone. The human was just standing there, complaining that the coffee in the break room had probably gone cold during the excitement. The director looked down at his own hands, his delicate, hollow-boned fingers. He thought about the operating charter of the Gale Ridge Sif Towers. They wrote protocols to survive the environment. They built filters and scrubbers and airtight seals to keep the universe out. But the humans didn't need a filter, they were the filter. A week later, the towers were still undergoing reconstruction. The smell of ozone and burnt sugar lingered in the vents, a permanent reminder of the day the vats failed. Trosick stood in the ruins of VAT 9 looking at the new bulkhead doors being installed. They were twice as thick as the old ones, reinforced with redundant seals. But he knew it wouldn't matter. If the fire came again, the machines would fail. The filters would clog, the avian workers would fall. He saw Corin walking across the bay toward her new station. She was wearing a new gaiter, a bright, clean blue this time. She stopped, looked at the charred remains of the hopper, and rolled her shoulders in that same sharp circular motion. She didn't look like a hero. She looked like someone who was ready to start a long, boring shift in a place that tried to kill her every single day. The medical droid finally finished analyzing the cast of the old scarf. It reported that the chemical structure of the ash had been altered by the human's unique enzymes, turning a volatile explosive into an inert, harmless lump of clay. Trosick didn't need the report to tell him what he already knew. He watched Corin pick up a heavy wrench and begin to tighten a bolt on the new vat. The ventilation fans kicked on, a low, steady thrum. Corin leaned against the metal casing, watching the first of the harvest grain pour into the hopper. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a small, wrinkled sandwich and took a bite. The dust began to rise in the air, a fine, golden mist. Corin coughed once, a sharp barking sound that echoed in the vast chamber. Then she wiped her mouth and went back to work. Across the triage bay, the blackened gator sat under a spotlight. The gray ash had dried into a series of jagged, crystalline peaks. It looked less like a piece of clothing and more like a piece of the bedrock itself. Vara Corin turned a valve, her boots crunching on a stray piece of charcoal. The new blue scarf fluttered slightly in the recycled breeze.